So when I was in school learning about epithelial tissues for the first time, I learned that they're one of the four major types of tissues in the human body. I learned that they cover or line the inner and outer surfaces, and that the most prominent example of epithelial tissues probably is our skin, right? And at the time, it just seemed very natural that the function of epithelial tissues would be to protect. They form barriers, right? The skin is obviously doing some kind of protective function, keeping ourselves safe from bacteria and dust and other things. But what seemed less obvious to me, and maybe you feel the same way, is why do some of these other functions keep getting listed as functions of the epithelium? So you might be learning that absorption and secretion might be functions of certain kinds of epithelial cells, like columnar epithelial cells. And the aim of this video is to maybe demystify this a little bit, maybe try and make it a little more natural, and we'll walk you through some examples of how epithelial tissues help in these functions. So let's talk about absorption. So one way to think about absorption is that it's a process that takes nutrients from your digestive system to your circulatory system. And this is important because your digestive system, while it's very well equipped to break down its input components, which is basically the food that you eat, into component nutrients, it's actually not very well equipped to take all the resultant nutrients to all the tissues in your body. You need a specialized kind of system to do that, and that's where your circulatory system is very well equipped, your blood and your heart and so on and so forth. But the point I want to kind of impress upon you right now is that this process of absorption is not a perfect process. So let me just write that down. Absorption is an imperfect process. And what do I mean by this? Well, I mean that not all of the nutrients that you ingest are going to be circulated in your body. So say you have 100 nutrient molecules as part of your food which you eat. Are you going to get 100 nutrient molecules circulating in your blood in some time? Well, no, because some of it is going to get lost. Well, some of it is just going to get broken down into something that's totally unusable. Some of it can just get lost in transportation, and some of it might just directly be excreted as is, right? So you might end up with, say, 60 to 70 nutrient molecules, and don't take these numbers too seriously. They're just example numbers. And in some cases, maybe there's something wrong with your body. Maybe you have diarrhea, so you're excreting things at a really high speed. So you might even be left with something really, really low, say 20 to 30% of everything you ingest is all you have left in your system, right? So it seems like your body has to deal with a kind of problem here, and it seems like there has to be some specialized mechanism to deal with this, right? And it turns out that there actually is. And at the risk of spoiling you a little bit, I'll just tell you that at least some of it has to do with epithelial cells. Well, that wasn't hard to guess, right? So let's just try and see what this could be. So let me kind of draw, or rather paste an image of the digestive system, and I'll just try and get rid of some of the text on top of that. So you can kind of see this neat little cartoon of the digestive system here, and typically what happens is that we ingest food that goes right in here, and it has to travel down into the system, and at some point it has to be absorbed into the bloodstream. Now if you remember your biology, the point at which this typically happens is somewhere here, or rather this is where most of the absorption takes place, which is the small intestine. Now what does the inside of the small intestine look like? Let me just try and zoom in a little into it. So if you zoom into a part of your small intestine and take a deep look inside of what it looks like, you might see something like this. So what you see here in the orange is just the wall of the intestine, but the green wavy line is the inner surface, and this is the empty space. This is the lumen, as it's called. And what you see on this side is just the wall of the intestine, and you can notice that it has these really wavy folded in structure that kind of seem to, it's interesting, right? It's not something that you see in every organ of your body. Now if you zoom in even further, if you take a closer look, you will see structures like this lining these folds. So these are like tiny little projections. They're about in the order of millimeters that just kind of poke out of the intestinal wall structure, and these are called villi. So let me just write that there. This thing is called villi. A single one is called villus, and the plural is basically villi. Now, what happens if you really take this further and really zoom into a villus? Do you see something interesting? Well, let's do that. And it turns out that if you zoom into a few villi, like this is what I'm doing, I'm zooming into that, and this is what you might end up seeing. This is what a typical intestinal pair of villi look like. Right, and you can see that it's got these, it's got these neat little cells. They're all columnar epithelial cells, and don't get misled by this image. They're all nucleated. So imagine that I've drawn nuclei on all of these images, but it's lined by these columnar epithelial cells, and on the surface of these cells you can see even more tiny projections. There's projections that are smaller than cells, and these things are called microvilli. Microvilli. I'm just doing the lazy thing of using the Greek alphabet for micro. Don't do that. You can just write it out. Let me just do that. Microvilli. Right. So what I want you to do is to just take a close look at the structure and maybe slightly be amazed by it, especially if you're seeing this for the first time, because clearly it seems to be built for a very specific purpose, right? Even if you don't know what the purpose is, it just seems like a very deliberate way to design it, just to keep nesting these structures one inside another. And it turns out that one thing that this achieves, these folds, and then the villi on top of that, and then the villi being lined by columnar epithelial cells that are lined with microvilli of their own. One of the things that it does is it increases surface area. So in other words, it increases the area of contact between the food and the intestinal wall, right? So you can imagine food molecules being on top of it, and it seems like the structure really effectively just traps all the food molecules and like tries to extract all the the juice, really the nutrients out of the food particles. And that is the function that you see here is really enabled by the presence of these columnar epithelial cells. So hopefully that makes it a little clear why epithelial cells can be super useful for absorption. So our next function is secretion. And for this, I want to use the example of the human respiratory system. So what you can see here is a schematic diagram of the human respiratory system. And what I want you to think about right now is what is the function of this part, this upper part of our respiratory system. And if you think about it, so the main function of the respiratory system as a whole is to kind of take in oxygen and exchange it for carbon dioxide while using it to generate energy, right? So the challenge that the respiratory system has is that what you're actually breathing in is not just oxygen. It's something that we call air, but air contains not just oxygen, it contains a number of other things. So it also contains other gases like nitrogen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, but it also contains, say, some dust particles. It also contains some microorganisms and a number of other solid waste that we wouldn't necessarily consider useful. So you could imagine that we don't actually want a lot of these things getting all the way down our lungs, especially things like dust, right? Because these are solid particles that can clog up your windpipe and clog up your lungs, making it really difficult for respiration to occur, which isn't really good for survival, right? So does your respiratory system have any adaptations to deal with this? And it turns out, yes. If you zoom into the wall of the windpipe, this is what you'll see. You'll see these columnar epithelial cells that produce a substance called mucus. So you'll have mucus that's lining the walls of our windpipe, and usually we are not very fond of mucus when we talk about it in a real life context, and it only becomes relevant to our lives when we have a cough or a cold. But mucus is constantly produced by our respiratory system, and one of its main functions is to kind of trap these dust particles. So let me just draw dust, say, in brown, and mucus is really good at trapping some of these dust particles and cellular debris. And these cells are not only good at secreting this mucus, they also have one additional specialization, which is these long projections called cilia. So these cilia, what they do is they kind of wave about left to right, or down to up here, and what this achieves is that it helps kind of move the mucus along with its trapped particles in a particular direction. Now that sounds super useful. So one possible use for it is to move whatever substance it is, maybe against the flow of gravity, and that's exactly what happens here. So the cellular debris and everything else that's caught in the mucus is moved against the force of gravity and expelled out of your body.